Keanu Reeves was known around the world as a famous actor, but very few people knew about another side of him. Behind the cameras, away from the bright lights of Hollywood, Keanu had a quiet love for learning. He had always been fascinated by numbers, logic, and the way mathematics revealed patterns in life. To him, math was not just about numbers on a page, it was about finding peace and beauty in order and problem solving. One afternoon, while visiting a university for a charity event, Keanu had some free time. Out of curiosity, he walked into a lecture hall where a calculus class was about to begin. He wanted to sit quietly at the back, observe, and maybe enjoy listening to the lesson like any regular student. The lecture hall was filled with young students, some tired, some busy talking to each other, and others preparing their notebooks. The professor entered with his usual stern look. He was known on campus as someone who liked discipline and enjoyed showing off his knowledge. He was proud of his sharp mind and reputation as a strict teacher. When his eyes caught Keanu sitting in the back row, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he didn't recognize him as the actor. To him, Keanu looked like a latecomer or maybe an outsider who was not supposed to be in the room. The professor decided to make an example of him. He thought, if this man is here to sit in my class, then I'll test him. Let's see how much he knows. As the class began, the professor lectured about advanced calculus, filling the board with symbols, derivatives, and long equations. Most students struggled to keep up, some scribbling quickly while others whispered in confusion. Then, with a sudden pause, the professor turned toward Keanu. His voice carried a slight edge of arrogance as he said, "You, at the back. Since you look so interested in this class, why don't you join me at the board? Let us see what you know about calculus." The entire room went quiet. Students turned their heads to see who the professor was pointing at. When they saw the quiet man with long hair stand up, some of them chuckled. A few whispered to each other, "This guy's going to embarrass himself. Nobody can solve the professor's problems." Keanu, however, did not react with anger or fear. Instead, he smiled gently, stood up, and walked calmly to the front of the class. He moved without any rush, like someone who had done this before. The professor picked up a piece of chalk, turned back to the board, and began writing a long, intimidating calculus equation. It was not a simple one that beginners could try, it was the kind of problem that even advanced students often took a long time to solve. After writing it out, he handed the chalk to Keanu with a smirk and said, "Why don't you try? Let's see if you belong in this class." The students watched eagerly, some already expecting failure. Keanu stood in front of the board, holding the chalk loosely in his hand. He studied the problem carefully, his eyes scanning each symbol, each function. He didn't rush. Instead, he took a quiet breath, like a painter observing his blank canvas before starting a masterpiece. Then, with steady hands, he began writing. His movements were smooth and confident. Each step of his solution was explained clearly in his calm, gentle voice. He didn't try to show off. He simply worked through the problem with patience, breaking down each part so it made sense. The students were surprised. At first, they thought it was luck, but as he kept going, they realized he truly understood the subject. His method was not the typical one they had seen before. It was cleaner, easier, almost artistic. The chalk moved across the board like it belonged there. The whispers in the classroom stopped. The sound of pages turning faded. Everyone was now watching silently, amazed by the way this quiet man handled something so complex with such ease. The professor crossed his arms, trying to look unimpressed. He interrupted once, asking, "Are you sure about that step? Most students get confused there." But Keanu, without losing focus, explained why his step was correct and even offered a simpler explanation that made sense to everyone. A few students nodded, whispering to each other, "I understand it now. He made it sound so simple." For them, it was like a door opening to a subject they had been struggling with for weeks. Minute by minute, the solution grew on the board. Lines of calculations turned into neat answers. Keanu's voice carried no pride, only a natural kindness, as if he wanted to help others see the beauty in the math. By the time he placed the chalk down, the problem was solved perfectly. He stepped back from the board, calm and composed, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. The room was filled with silence for a moment. Then came the gasps of disbelief. Students looked at each other, wide-eyed, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Some clapped softly, others smiled in admiration. Even those who had doubted him felt respect rising inside them. The professor's face, however, tightened. He had expected to humiliate a stranger, but instead, he was the one left speechless. The answer on the board was flawless. The explanation was crystal clear. And the man who had given it wasn't even a student in his class. Keanu turned slightly and handed the chalk back to the professor with a polite smile. "Thank you," he said softly, "that was a good problem." His words were not filled with sarcasm or mockery. They were genuine, showing appreciation for the challenge. The students could see the contrast. Where the professor had tried to use arrogance, Keanu had responded with humility and grace. As Keanu walked back to his seat, the students whispered excitedly, still processing what had just happened. Some of them began to realize who he was. A girl in the front row whispered, "Wait a second, isn't that Keanu Reeves?" Her friend gasped, recognizing him too. Slowly, the realization spread across the room. A few phones came out, but most students simply watched him with respect. The calm man who had solved the impossible problem was not only a Hollywood star but also, clearly, a math genius in his own right. The professor, still holding the chalk, felt the weight of the situation. He had thought this would be an easy way to show off his authority, but instead, the lesson had turned back on him. While the students were still whispering in amazement, Keanu sat quietly, his eyes gentle, as if nothing unusual had happened. For him, it wasn't about showing off. It was about enjoying the process of solving a problem and perhaps teaching something along the way. That afternoon would not be forgotten. For the students, it was the day they learned that brilliance can come from unexpected places, and that humility makes true genius shine even brighter. For the professor, it was only the beginning of a humbling experience he was not prepared for. The classroom was still buzzing after Keanu Reeves had calmly solved the professor's difficult calculus problem. The students could not stop whispering to one another, their faces filled with surprise and excitement. Some of them had struggled for weeks with such problems, yet here was a man they only knew as an actor, solving it with ease and explaining it in a way that made sense to everyone. For the first time in that lecture hall, calculus felt less like a monster and more like a puzzle waiting to be understood. But while the students admired Keanu, the professor's pride was deeply unsettled. He had been known for years as the sharpest mind in the department. To him, it felt insulting that a visitor, a man he thought had no business in the classroom, had shown such skill in front of his students. The professor forced a thin smile and said, "Not bad. But one problem does not prove much. Anyone can get lucky once." His voice carried a touch of unease, but he tried to cover it with arrogance. The students looked at him, sensing his discomfort, but no one dared to speak against him. Keanu, however, did not respond with annoyance. He simply nodded, as though agreeing with the professor's words. "You are right," he said gently, "one problem is not enough. Mathematics is about consistency." The professor frowned. He could not allow himself to look weak in front of his students. So, he turned back to the board, wiped it clean, and began writing another problem. This one was longer, more advanced, the type usually reserved for graduate students or even researchers. The chalk squeaked as symbols, integrals, and exponents filled the board. By the time he finished, The equation stretched across almost the entire length of the chalkboard. He turned back to Keanu, his eyes sharp, and said, "Here. Let's see how you handle this. If you can solve this, then maybe we can say you know a little about calculus." The room went quiet again. The students leaned forward, their notebooks forgotten, their attention locked on the man at the front. Some were nervous for Keanu. Others were secretly rooting for him, hoping he would once again surprise them. Keanu stood up calmly, brushing his long hair back from his face, and walked toward the board. He picked up the chalk, looked at the problem, and smiled softly to himself. Instead of rushing, Keanu placed the chalk down for a moment and asked the professor politely, "Do you mind if I explain while solving? Sometimes the steps are easier to follow when you speak them aloud." The professor gave a stiff nod, though he clearly did not like the idea of giving his class to someone else. Still, he stepped back with folded arms. Keanu picked up the chalk again and began working. His style was different from the professor's. Instead of diving straight into formulas, he broke the problem down into smaller, simpler parts. "First," he said in his calm voice, "let us look at the structure. This equation is complicated, but hidden inside it are simple steps. If we take them one at a time, it becomes less frightening." His words were soothing, like a teacher speaking to students rather than someone trying to impress. The students listened closely. As he moved through the problem, he explained each step with patience. He compared mathematical ideas to things in daily life, making them easier to picture. For example, when he spoke about limits, he explained them as approaching a destination but never quite stepping on the final stone. When he described derivatives, he compared them to watching the speed of a car as it changes second by second. These simple pictures made the once confusing symbols come alive for the class. The professor tried to interrupt again, asking, "But what about this special condition? Most people miss it." Keanu paused, turned to him politely, and answered, "Yes, you are correct, and that's why this step must be handled carefully." Then he demonstrated a clever method to include the condition. His explanation was not only correct but also elegant, so clear that the students finally understood something that had seemed mysterious to them for weeks. One by one, the complicated parts of the problem melted into simple truths. The board filled with his neat handwriting, each step flowing naturally into the next. The students began to smile. Some even whispered excitedly, "I get it now. This makes sense." Others were busy taking notes, hoping to capture every word. As Keanu neared the end, the professor's face grew more tense. He had chosen this problem specifically because it was difficult even for him to teach. Yet here was Keanu, breaking it down into pieces so smoothly that the students were learning more in 20 minutes than they had in several lectures. Finally, Keanu wrote the last step, circled the answer, and placed the chalk back on the board tray. He turned around, dusting his hands lightly, and said, "And that is the solution. It looks complicated at first, but every complicated problem is just a collection of simple steps waiting to be seen." The classroom erupted into quiet applause. At first, just a few claps, but soon the entire class was clapping loudly. The sound echoed off the walls of the lecture hall. Students who had once dreaded calculus were smiling, their eyes bright with the joy of finally understanding. Keanu gave them a small bow of thanks, his face still humble and calm. He did not bask in the applause. He seemed happier knowing that the students had learned something new. The professor, however, stood frozen, his pride deeply shaken. He had wanted to humiliate Keanu, to show the class that no outsider could outshine him. Instead, his plan had backfired. Not only had Keanu solved the problems, but he had also taught the students in a way that made them excited to learn. The respect in the room had shifted. The students, who once saw the professor as the only authority in math, were now looking at Keanu with admiration. To break the silence, one student called out, "Sir, can he teach us more often?" I finally understood derivatives. The class laughed, and even more students joined in, agreeing. The professor's face turned red, though he forced a smile. "We will continue our lessons," he said quickly, "but remember, one guest does not replace your professor." Keanu nodded, not wishing to cause any embarrassment. "Of course," he said gently. "I am only here today by chance. Your professor has much more to teach you than I do. I only wanted to share another way of looking at the problem." His words carried no pride, only kindness, and they softened the tension in the room. Still, the lesson of the day had already been written in the students' hearts. They had witnessed something special, a man they thought was only an actor showing a hidden side of genius, combined with humility. For them, the afternoon became unforgettable. They realized that true brilliance does not need to shout or humiliate. It shines through calm confidence and a willingness to share knowledge. As the lecture ended, the students left the hall buzzing with energy. Some talked about the problems Keanu had solved, others about how amazing it was to see him in person. A few could not stop repeating his words about simple steps hiding inside complicated problems. For them, math no longer seemed as frightening as before. Keanu, however, quietly slipped out of the hall without making a scene. He left as calmly as he had entered, blending back into the world like a quiet shadow. He had no interest in fame or attention here. For him, the joy came from the spark of understanding he had seen in the students' eyes. And while the professor stood in his office later that day, staring at the chalkboard that Keanu had filled with such clear solutions, he realized something he had never admitted before: sometimes humility can teach more than pride ever could. The next morning the story of what happened in the calculus class spread quickly across the university. Students from different departments were talking about it in the cafeteria, in the library, and even outside on the campus lawns. "Did you hear? That quiet man solved Professor Grant's hardest equations like they were nothing," one student said with excitement. "And he wasn't just right, he explained it better than the professor ever did." Another replied, "That wasn't just some man. That was Keanu Reeves, the actor." Some people did not believe it at first. They thought it was just a rumor or a joke. But those who had been inside the classroom swore it was true. They described every detail: how Keanu had calmly walked to the board, how he had solved each problem step by step, and how he had explained it so clearly that even the weakest students suddenly understood. Within hours, the incident became the most talked about story on campus. The professor, meanwhile, was restless. He spent the night replaying the events in his mind. He had prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, and yet in front of his own students, Keanu had shown a depth of understanding that shook him. He told himself, it was just chance. Anyone can prepare a trick or memorize a solution. But deep down, he knew what he had witnessed was real. The calmness, the logical steps, the creative way Keanu explained concepts, those were not things someone could fake. When the professor entered his lecture hall the next day, the atmosphere felt different. The students were respectful, but their eyes no longer held the same unquestioning awe for him. Instead, they were filled with curiosity and excitement. Many of them hoped Keanu would return, even if just to sit quietly at the back. They wanted to learn more from him, because for the first time, math had felt alive. Trying to reassert his authority, the professor started the class with a sharp tone. "Today, we will focus on advanced integration," he announced, writing quickly on the board. "And let me remind you, no visitor or guest will be solving problems for you today. This is a serious academic environment." His words made some students smile quietly. They could hear the insecurity behind them. But just as the class settled in, the door opened softly. Keanu walked in again, dressed as simply as before, carrying nothing but a small notebook. The students sat up straighter, their eyes lighting up with surprise. A wave of whispers ran across the room. The professor froze for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Ah, our visitor has returned," he said stiffly. "Well, since you seem so eager to learn, perhaps you would like to continue your performance." Keanu gave a gentle nod, his expression calm as always. "Only if you don't mind," he said politely. "I don't want to interrupt your teaching." The professor forced a smile. "Very well," he replied, though his pride was already stirring. This time, the professor wrote an even more intimidating problem. It was not just long, it was tricky, involving multiple theorems, substitutions, and conditions that only a true mathematician would notice. He wanted to prove that Keanu's success the day before was luck, nothing more. "Here," he said with a hint of challenge in his voice, "this one will not be so easy." The class fell silent. All eyes were on Keanu as he approached the board. He studied the equation carefully, then turned to the professor. "This is a beautiful problem," he said softly. "It looks complicated, but I think we can make it simple together." Those words caught the attention of the students. Instead of saying "I will solve it," he said "we can make it simple together." It felt like he was inviting them to be part of the process. Keanu began writing. He started by breaking the large equation into smaller pieces. "Let's first take this part," he explained, pointing to the left-hand side. "It may look messy, but actually, it behaves like a familiar pattern we already know." His voice was calm, never rushed. Slowly, he built a path through the jungle of symbols. The students followed, their eyes wide, their pens racing across their notebooks. The professor interrupted again, trying to trip him up. "But what about the second condition? That usually ruins the solution." Keanu smiled slightly and said, "Yes, if you go directly, it looks like it ruins everything. But if you step back and look at it another way, it becomes a doorway instead of a wall." Then, with a clever substitution, he transformed the problem into something far simpler. Gasps spread through the classroom. Even the students who hated calculus could see the beauty of it. Step by step, the problem unfolded. What had seemed impossible at first now looked logical, almost elegant. By the time Keanu reached the final line, the students were leaning forward, some with mouths slightly open, as if they were watching magic. He circled the answer, put down the chalk, and said, "And that's it? Complicated problems are just stories waiting to be understood." The room erupted again, louder than before. Students clapped, some even cheering. For them, it wasn't just about the correct answer, it was about the way Keanu made math feel alive, almost like art. They had never seen anyone approach a problem with such patience and humility. The professor's face burned red. He tried to remain composed, but he could feel his authority slipping away. For years, he had ruled the classroom with fear and pride, but now the students were inspired by someone else, a man who wasn't even supposed to be there. He cleared his throat and said quickly, "Very good. But remember, mathematics is not entertainment. It requires discipline." Keanu nodded respectfully. "Of course. Discipline is important. But so is joy. When students find joy in learning, discipline follows naturally." His words hit the professor harder than the solved problems had. The students nodded eagerly, their admiration for Keanu growing even more. After class ended, groups of students gathered around Keanu in the hallway. Some asked him questions about the problems, while others simply thanked him. "You made it so clear," one student said. "I finally understood something I had struggled with for months." Keanu smiled warmly and replied, "You had it in you all along. You just needed to see it from a different angle." The professor watched from the doorway, torn between frustration and reflection. He had tried to humiliate Keanu, but instead, he had only exposed his own arrogance. The man he had underestimated had not only solved his toughest problems but had also won the hearts of his students with humility and kindness. That evening, The professor sat alone in his office, staring at the empty chalkboard. He asked himself quietly, why did I feel the need to challenge him? Was it pride? Was it fear? For the first time in years, he began to see how his teaching style had become about showing his own brilliance rather than helping his students shine. Keanu's calm words echoed in his mind, when students find joy in learning, discipline follows naturally. Meanwhile, Keanu walked out of the campus quietly, blending into the city streets as though nothing extraordinary had happened. For him, it was never about proving himself. It was simply about sharing what he loved: problem solving, patience, and the beauty of learning. The students, however, would never forget it. They would tell the story for years: the day a famous actor walked into their calculus class, solved the hardest problems with ease, and taught them that humility and joy were just as important as intelligence. And for the professor, it was the beginning of a lesson he never expected to learn. The following day, the university felt different. It was as if something had shifted in the air. Students walked across the campus with an unusual sense of excitement. In small groups, they continued to talk about the mysterious visitor who had solved the toughest calculus problems with such grace. Many could not stop replaying the moment in their minds: the calm way Keanu had walked to the board, the confidence with which he explained each step, and the humility in his voice when he spoke to the class. To them, it was more than just math. It was a life lesson wrapped inside equations and chalk dust. The professor, however, felt uneasy. He had spent the entire night awake, thinking about what had happened. His pride had taken a hit, and though he wanted to brush it off, the truth kept haunting him. He had tried to embarrass Keanu in front of the students, but instead, it was he who had been humbled. Worse still, the students had seen it happen with their own eyes. The thought of them respecting someone else more than him was painful. But deep inside, he also felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: curiosity. By the time the lecture hall filled again, the professor had made up his mind. He would try once more. If Keanu returned, he would test him with a problem so complex that no ordinary mind could solve it. Maybe then the students would see that yesterday was only a coincidence. The students settled into their seats, whispering eagerly, waiting to see if the mysterious man would appear again. Right on time, the door opened. Keanu walked in quietly, carrying nothing but a simple notebook and a kind smile. The students straightened up immediately, some even clapping softly as he entered. The professor forced himself to stay calm. He greeted the class, then turned to Keanu and said, "Since you are here once more, perhaps you would like to try another challenge." The students exchanged glances. They knew the professor's pride was at play, but they also wanted to see Keanu solve another problem. Keanu, as calm as ever, nodded politely. "If you like," he said softly. "But only if it helps the students. After all, they are the real reason we are here." His words made the class smile, but the professor felt a sting of guilt. He had been thinking of himself, while Keanu kept thinking of the students. This time, the professor filled the board with a massive equation, combining several branches of calculus, algebra, and even a touch of number theory. It was the kind of problem that would take hours for even advanced mathematicians. He turned back and said, "Here. Let's see if your talent reaches this far." The class grew quiet. They could sense the professor's determination to prove something. Keanu studied the board carefully, then picked up the chalk. For a moment, he stood still, thinking, his eyes moving across the symbols. Then he turned to the students and said gently, "This problem looks frightening, doesn't it? But let's not panic. Let's take it piece by piece." He began working slowly, explaining every step. "First, let's simplify this portion," he said, pointing to the left side. "It looks messy, but really it hides something familiar." He broke it down, step by step, until the first part was solved. Then he moved on to the next, showing how it connected. His method was not rushed. It was like watching someone untangle a long knot with patience, never pulling too hard, never giving up. The students leaned forward, some scribbling notes, others simply watching with awe. They were not just learning math, they were learning patience, logic, and the beauty of taking things slowly. Even the professor, though unwilling to admit it, felt himself following along with interest. The way Keanu explained each part was different from the way he usually taught. It was warmer, more human, less about showing off intelligence and more about sharing understanding. Halfway through, a student raised a hand nervously. "Excuse me, sir," she said to Keanu, "I never understood why we use the substitution. Can you explain it again?" Keanu smiled kindly. "Of course," he said, and he explained it again, this time using an example from everyday life. He compared the substitution to changing roads while driving. Sometimes the highway is blocked, so you take a side road that leads back to the same destination. The student's face lit up with understanding. She nodded eagerly, finally grasping something she had struggled with for weeks. Keanu continued, step by step, until at last he reached the final solution. He circled the answer neatly and put down the chalk. The entire board was filled with his careful work, yet somehow it looked organized, almost beautiful, like a piece of art. He turned to the class and said softly, "There it is. Even the most complicated problems can be solved if you stay calm and break them down." The students burst into applause again, louder than ever before. Some stood up, clapping with genuine admiration. Their faces glowed with excitement, not only because the problem was solved but because they had learned so much in the process. For them, it was as if Keanu had opened a door they didn't know existed. The professor stood frozen. He could not deny it any longer. This man was not just talented, he was brilliant. And what made it even more remarkable was that he carried no pride in it. Where the professor had tried to show superiority, Keanu had shown humility. Where the professor wanted to prove himself, Keanu wanted to help others. At last, unable to hold back, the professor asked quietly, "Who are you really? Why do you hide your talent like this?" Keanu looked at him kindly and said, "I'm just a man who loves learning. Acting is my job, but mathematics has always been a quiet passion of mine. Knowledge is not something to hide or to use for pride. It's something to share." The words sank deep into the professor's heart. For years, he had built his reputation on fear and authority, making students believe that only he could guide them. But now, in front of him, stood someone who had shown that real greatness came with humility. The students, sensing the professor's silence, began to cheer even louder. Some even walked up to Keanu to thank him personally. The professor watched as his students smiled with genuine happiness, something he had rarely seen in his classroom. In that moment, he realized the truth: his pride had blinded him for too long. He had forgotten what teaching was truly about. It was not about showing off his intelligence. It was about inspiring others to learn, to grow, and to believe in themselves. When the applause finally died down, Keanu handed the chalk back to the professor and said softly, "Thank you for letting me share. Your students are very bright. With your guidance, they will achieve great things." The professor took the chalk slowly, his hand trembling just a little. For the first time in many years, he felt humbled, not by someone trying to defeat him, but by someone showing him a better way. That day, the students left the lecture hall more inspired than ever before. They had not only learned math, they had learned about humility, kindness, and the true meaning of wisdom. And the professor, though still quiet, carried a new thought in his heart: perhaps it was time for him to change too. The story of Keanu Reeves in the calculus class had already become a legend on campus by the time the final lecture of the week arrived. Students from other departments, who normally would never set foot in a math lecture, were whispering about it. Some even tried to sneak into the class just to see if Keanu would show up again. For them, it wasn't only about seeing a celebrity, it was about witnessing the way he made difficult math look simple, and the way he carried himself with so much humility. They felt something rare and inspiring, something that went far beyond equations on a chalkboard. The professor, too, had changed since the first day. His pride was still there, but it was quieter now, less controlling. For the first time in years, he was questioning himself. He realized that maybe he had been teaching the wrong way, focused more on proving his brilliance rather than helping his students grow. Keanu's presence had reminded him of something he had long forgotten: teaching was not about showing off, it was about guiding. Still, he wasn't sure how to admit this to the students. On that final day, the lecture hall filled quickly. The students sat buzzing with excitement, many secretly hoping Keanu would walk in again. The professor tried to begin the class normally, writing some equations on the board, but the anticipation in the room was thick. Then, almost as if the universe had planned it, the door opened. Keanu walked in quietly, carrying his small notebook, wearing the same simple clothes as before. The students immediately straightened up, their whispers spreading like ripples across water. A few clapped softly, others smiled brightly. The professor paused, looking at Keanu, and then did something unexpected. Instead of challenging him again, he said calmly, "Would you like to take the class today? I think my students might learn something valuable from you." The room gasped. For years, the professor had never let anyone else take his place at the board. This was a moment of humility that no one had ever imagined. Keanu, surprised by the offer, smiled gently. "Only if you're sure," he said. "I wouldn't want to take your place." The professor shook his head. "Knowledge belongs to everyone. I think today, we can all learn together." The students clapped loudly, moved by what they were witnessing. Keanu walked slowly to the front, picked up the chalk, and looked at the students. "All right," he said softly, "but let's do this a little differently today." Instead of writing a complicated problem immediately, he turned to the students and asked, "What part of calculus do you find hardest? What makes you feel frustrated when you see it?" Hands shot up all across the room. Some said derivatives, others said integrals, while a few mentioned limits and series. Keanu listened carefully to each voice, nodding with patience. "Good," he said after hearing them. "That means we know where to start. Let's take the scariest parts and make them friendly." He began with a simple concept but explained it in a way no one had ever heard before. He connected math to music, to nature, to everyday life. He showed how curves in calculus were like waves in the ocean, how integrals could be compared to collecting drops of rain until you filled a bucket, and how limits were like chasing the horizon. You could get closer and closer but never quite touch it. The students laughed, nodded, and most importantly, understood. The professor sat at the side of the room, quietly watching. He felt a mix of emotions: humility, admiration, and also gratitude. He could see the faces of his students glowing with excitement. He realized that for years he had been teaching them to fear failure, when what they really needed was encouragement and imagination. Keanu solved a few problems on the board, but he kept his focus on making the students feel involved. At one point, he handed the chalk to a shy student in the back and said, "Why don't you try this part? Don't worry about mistakes, we'll figure it out together." The student, nervous at first, walked to the board and began writing. When he stumbled, Keanu encouraged him kindly, guiding him with small hints until he reached the answer. The class cheered for the student, and his face lit up with pride. By the end of the session, the board was filled with equations, diagrams, and even small sketches that Keanu had drawn to make the ideas clearer. But what truly filled the room was not just knowledge, it was confidence. The students no longer felt afraid of calculus. They felt curious, excited, and ready to explore more. When Keanu put down the chalk for the last time, the students rose to their feet in thunderous applause. The sound echoed through the hallways, drawing the attention of people passing by outside. Keanu raised his hand slightly, asking them to calm down, and said gently, "Thank you. But remember, you did this yourselves. I only showed you another way of looking at it. Math, like life, is about patience and perspective. When you feel stuck, don't give up. Step back, look at it differently, and you'll find the answer waiting for you." The students nodded, many of them touched by his words. Some even felt tears in their eyes, because for the first time, they felt truly seen not just as students, but as people capable of learning and growing. The professor stood up then, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it before. "I owe you all something," he said, looking at the students. "I have been teaching you with too much pride and too little heart. Watching Mr. Reeves today reminded me what teaching really means. From now on, I promise to teach you with more patience, more care, and less ego." The students were stunned. They had never seen their professor speak with such honesty. Some clapped again, this time for him, respecting his courage to admit his mistake. Keanu smiled warmly, walking over to shake the professor's hand. The two men stood there, not as rivals, but as people who had learned from each other. When the class finally ended, the students crowded around Keanu, thanking him, asking for pictures, and sharing how much his words had meant to them. Keanu, as humble as always, reminded them that they were the real stars of the classroom. "Remember," he told them, "math doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to anyone willing to look closely and try again." As he left the hall, the sunlight spilled through the windows, casting a glow on the chalk-dusted board that still carried his writing. For the students, it was more than just math lessons they would remember. It was the lesson of humility, patience, and kindness. Years later, many of those students would still tell the story, the day their calculus professor tried to humiliate Keanu Reeves, only to discover that he was a math genius. But more importantly, they remembered how he turned their fear of math into joy, and how he reminded their professor and them that true greatness is always quiet, humble, and generous. That was the real equation Keanu solved, not numbers on a board, but hearts in a classroom.